And now we're going to our final geographical area of the Great Glasshouse. From Canary Islands, we're going to California. Right, we're in the area of California known as the Chaparral. It's a sort of place where westerns used to be filmed, old style western films. And it's a place where people were on cowboys with big herds of cattle, and the cowboys used to wear these leather trousers called chaps. And that chaps is related to Chaparral, because as they used to ride around, it used to be very spiky everywhere, and really used to lacerate the legs, so hence the word chaps. Now, one of the most iconic plants that you used to get in the, that you still get in the Chaparral is this Yucca plant here, and we've had it here in the National Botanic Garden for quite a few years now, and just a few years ago it started sending up these amazingly wonderful big tall candle-like flowers. The name of this plant is Our Lady's Candle. It's Yucca Whippereye, and people used to go out to the Chaparral and collect these big flowering spikes, and they would attach them to the side of the cars, and you could go back decades. It must have been quite a sight, and probably terribly destructive to the habitat. This plant is particularly important though for this insect here. Can you see this white moth thing? This has been made by a stitching group based in the Botanic Garden called the Stitching Bee, and they've made stitched representations of plants from all our Mediterranean climate zones represented in the Great Glasshouse, and they're dotted about as you go for a walk round here. But this plant, this moth has a particularly interesting story because its whole life cycle is based on this yucca plant. It is dependent, the yucca plant is dependent on pollination by the yucca moth, as it's called, and the yucca moth gets all its food and water and everything it needs. All its whole life cycle is around the yucca. They're two interdependent species. This plant is called Ceanothus. It's called the Lioxinophilus, and you get loads of types of Ceanothus all across California. It smells lovely as well, and you often find it in garden plants in Britain now. But it's a really characteristic plant of the Chaparral, and it fulfills several functions, not least of which is it copes really well with fire. And a bit like the eucalyptus tree we saw earlier, its leaves have this kind of flammable sort of oil on it. So when the flame comes, when the fires, natural fires occur on the Chaparral, they come through and the oils accelerate the fire. So it almost explodes with it. What it does, it draws the fire through much quicker than it would do if they went through slowly. So when the fire goes through, it chars all the top, and the fire actually helps the germination of the seeds of the Ceanothus plant, which can take advantage of the cleared land once the fire has gone through. This is the Californian Sagebush. We've been talking about smells before, and this one's really, really distinctive. It's, if you know wormwood, which is a kind of a weed that grows in Wales, but it's also maybe some amongst you may have tasted absinthe, which is a very vicious sort of spirit, which is favoured by French artists from 100 years ago, but is also made from a plant very much like this. But this plant's really interesting because it's really well adapted to the fires that rage through the Chaparral every 15 to 25 years, because when the fires come through, it's able to re-sprout from just underneath the ground. It's really, really well adapted like that. It's also to cope with sometimes when you get hot, dry summers, when there's been no rain for ages, when it's really, really hot. This will also drop its leaves, and that stops evaporation. But there's one other final thing which is really good about this, and it's again linked to the smell. That on the in the Chaparral, you get a lot of skunk. Now, skunk are renowned for smelling really, really bad. That just can't, the smell can't be obliterated. But so it's rumoured, if you rub this onto the smell of a skunk, that's the one thing that might actually counter it. At the moment, there's only one flower out, but later on in the year, there'll be hundreds of plants of the Californian poppy out here. A spectacular orange display you get, and this is what you get in the Chaparral, because often when the fires come through, so every 15 to 25 years, it clears all the rest of the vegetation, frazzles it all off, leaves bare earth, and it's a perfect conditions then for the Californian poppy to suddenly appear. It'll suddenly come out the ground, it's got no competition, and then it completely fills up a whole landscape with orange poppies. Okay, well that concludes our tour of the Great Glasshouse, but there's just a couple of things to bear in mind as well. First of all, when's the best time to come and see this? Well, if you go to the Mediterranean Basin, the best time to see flowers is in the springtime. That's when you get the most diversity, and it's because it's after you don't get loads of flowers out in the hot, dry summer. So often people go on holiday to these places during the hottest times, and really there's not much to see. So right now is becoming a really good time to come and visit the National Botanic Garden of Wales. And bear in mind that some of these plants are also from the southern hemisphere, so they're a little bit dizzy about when's the right time to come up. But throughout the whole year it's kind of interesting. You still get plenty to see even during the winter. But the other issue to really bear in mind is that these areas that we've been looking at, they are all areas of the world which are under enormous pressure from human beings. So if I say the name Australia, California, Mediterranean, South Africa, they're all great wine growing areas. They're areas where people like to go and play golf. So the great tourism areas, the areas where people live and continue to expand where they're living. So the pressures that are on these habitats is enormous. Trying to squash in the needs of human beings with nature can be really tricky. And of course the one thing that human beings really don't want is fire. So they often suppress fires happening, but in the forests, in the scrublands of these places, all the dead leaves build up. So every now and again you get enormous fires, and this is when you see news stories, for instance from Hollywood, of film stars running away from the flames of the fire. It's because nature has not been allowed to have its natural cycles. So we were faced with this habitat here, which again, let me just reflect upon the fact these habitats occupy less than 2% of the planet, of the landmass of the planet, but they have over 20% of all the species on Earth. They are really, really important, and we have to find solutions of how to protect nature whilst living within it.